Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that has haunted the scholars of the Ordo Xenos for decades. A question so unsettling that those who chase it too far down tend to stop sleeping well. It is not the question of how to stop the Tyranids, though that question has consumed careers and burned out minds in its own right. It is not the question of where they came from, though that mystery is terrifying enough on its own. The question, the one that makes even grizzled inquisitors set down their data slates and stare into the middle distance, is this: what in the entire universe could possibly frighten them? Let that sit for a moment. Because here is what we know about the Tyranids. They are not some regional power testing the borders of a neighboring empire. They are not raiders seeking resources, not a civilization expanding for political reasons, not a species lashing out from wounded pride. They do not have politics. They do not have pride. They are not an army with supply lines and attrition concerns and political will that might eventually falter. The Tyranids are a superorganism, a single, vast, incomprehensible mind stretched across light years of space, wearing countless billions of bodies like a man might wear a coat. They have consumed planets. They have consumed systems. They have, by some accounts in the lore, consumed entire galaxies, and they did not start with ours. Yet they came from somewhere else entirely. They crossed the black, endless cold of the intergalactic void, one of the most inhospitable environments that the physics of this universe will allow. And they arrived at the rim of the Milky Way, ready to devour everything inside it. They came not as a scout, not as a polite advance party, not even as a full invasion in the way that word is usually understood. They came as a force so massive that the three great hive fleets the galaxy has actually faced so far are, in the quiet assessment of Imperial scholars doing honest math in sealed vaults, merely the outermost fingers of something unimaginably larger that is still approaching from the dark. And somewhere out there, in the direction they came from, something may be waiting. That is what we are going to sit with today, all of it. But from the very biology and architecture of the Tyranid race, the way the hive mind actually functions at a deep level, the specific mechanics by which a world is consumed, the patient horror of the Genestealer vanguard, to the specific events that drew the swarm toward our galaxy in the first place, to the nightmarish cascade of wars they have waged since arriving, to the figure of the Silent King, out in the void seeing something he refuses to fully describe. And finally, we will follow the thread of what might actually be behind the Great Devourer, pushing it forward, because that question deserves more than a one-line dismissal. This is going to be a long one. I want to take our time with this. The Tyranids are one of the most genuinely disturbing concepts in all of Warhammer 40,000. And I think they deserve the kind of attention that lets the full weight of them settle in properly. So get comfortable, take a slow breath. And because once you understand what the Tyranids really are, not just as a tabletop army or a monster of the weak threat, but as a genuine piece of cosmic horror, you will never quite look at a quiet night sky the same way again. Part 1. A species born in darkness. What we know about their origin. The Tyranids have no homeworld, at least none that anyone alive has ever identified, and in all likelihood, none that still exists in any recognizable form. They are defined, fundamentally, by the absence of origin. Every other major faction in Warhammer 40,000 has a place. The Imperium has terror, the beating, corrupted, barely functional heart of human civilization. The Necrons have their tomb worlds, ancient burial complexes scattered across the galaxy, where 60 million years of sleep are slowly, imperfectly ending. The Orcs drift and settle and spread, but their spores trace back to genetic engineering by the Old Ones. The Eldar mourn a civilization that burned in an instant of excess 10,000 years ago. Chaos dwells in the eternal warp, fed by every emotion every living being in the material universe has ever felt. But the Tyranids simply appeared at the edge of the galaxy, as if they had always been approaching from just out of sight, as if the darkness between the stars had finally organized itself into something that ate. What the Imperium knows, what anyone in the Milky Way knows, is this. They are extragalactic. They did not evolve somewhere in the Milky Way and spread outward. They were not some failed experiment of the old ones that was contained and then escaped. They came from outside. They crossed the intergalactic void, a region of space so empty, so cold, so utterly devoid of anything that most species would consider it a death sentence to enter. And they emerged at the galaxy's fringe, driven by something so fundamental to their existence that even the freezing nothing between galaxies could not stop them. The void between galaxies is genuinely hard to imagine in human terms. The distances are measured in millions of light years. The nearest large galaxy to the Milky Way, Andromeda, sits approximately 2.5 million light years away. As the space between contains almost nothing, rogue stars cast out from their parent galaxies in ancient collisions, the occasional stray nebula too thin and cold to produce new stars, cold and ancient light from objects so distant they barely register, even on Adeptus Mechanicus instruments calibrated for galactic-scale observation. To cross that distance requires either incomprehensible patience, a biological design that makes the passage of geological time feel like a brief nap, or the kind of engineered organism that can hibernate for millions of years in the absolute cold and emerge from that sleep ready to feed. The Tyranids have all three. Their hive fleets travel without touching the warp. But this detail is significant and deeply strange in a universe where almost every other star-faring race depends on the Imperium, that psychic parallel dimension where the emotions of living beings condense into something navigable, to move between star systems at any practical speed. The Tyranids do not. Instead, they use gravity, a specialized organism called the narval, essentially a living engine built around psychic gravity manipulation, folds the space around the fleet, in allowing them to move faster than light through real space itself. No warp entry, no warp exit, no navigator required, no risk of warp storms or chaos predation from the entities that dwell in the Imperium. Just pure biological engineering, allowing a fleet of living ships to slingshot through the physical universe at superluminal speeds, using the gravity of star systems as leverage. This is one of the core reasons the Tyranids are so alien compared to every other threat the galaxy faces. But you cannot corrupt them through the warp, the way you can lead chaos-touched mortals toward damnation. You cannot bait them into a warp anomaly and let the Imperium tear them apart. You cannot trap them with a psychic null field, the way you might disrupt a chaos incursion. They exist in the material universe on their own terms, bound by physics rather than the tides of the Imperium and the hive mind that connects them all, though it does cast a psychic shadow into the warp, or the phenomenon known as the shadow in the warp that we'll discuss in detail shortly, does not rely on the warp to function. Its psychic communication is something different, something more fundamental and biological, transmitted through the synaptic network of the swarm itself, rather than through the chaotic currents of the Imperium. This means that wherever the Tyranids came from, it was real. It was physical. They did not emerge from some extra-dimensional hell or a collapsing pocket reality. They evolved somewhere, or were created somewhere, in the ordinary material universe that you and I and the Emperor of Mankind all share. They are out there in the same cosmos, somewhere behind the places our best instruments can barely reach. And they have been traveling for so long that the concept of time as it applies to mortal civilizations has become essentially meaningless to them. And some sources within the Warhammer lore suggest they may have consumed 1,000 galaxies before arriving at ours. The Lexicanum notes this is presented as a figure from another source rather than established canon, and that claim should be treated with appropriate caution. But even if it is overstated by an order of magnitude, even if the real number is closer to 100 galaxies, the implication remains staggering. If the Tyranids have been doing this across multiple galaxies, they predate the Milky Way's current political landscape by epochs. They were feasting on other corners of the universe while the old ones were still waging the war in heaven, while the Necrons were still flesh, while the first glimmers of human civilization were still millions of years from striking fire. They are, in that sense, more ancient and more traveled than anything else in the setting. The Cetan star gods who devoured suns, the entities that shaped the galaxy in the age before recorded history. The Tyranids may have been consuming worlds when those entities were young, and yet they came here. They crossed the void. They turned their incomprehensible mass toward a specific galaxy, ours, and began the slow, implacable process of devouring it. The question of why, as we will explore in detail, has two competing answers at its core. And the truth may be somewhere between them, or maybe something else entirely that the lore has not yet revealed. The first answer is the simple one: hunger. The Tyranids consume biomass. That is the core of their existence, the fundamental drive that shapes everything about their biology and their behavior. Every planet stripped bare, and every civilization dissolved into protein soup and fed upward through towering capillary pylons into the waiting bellies of the hive ships. All of it is fuel for the ongoing biological arms race that is Tyranid evolution. They feed so they can grow. They grow so they can field more organisms. More organisms means more consumption. The mathematics of their existence is a spiral that only ends when there is literally nothing left to consume, and they have never been willing to stop the spiral. Whereas if they exhausted whatever galaxy or galaxies they came from, if the local group of galaxies around the Milky Way represents the next meal after a long crossing through a depleted region, then hunger is reason enough, and no greater explanation is required. The second answer is the unsettling one. Something drove them here. Not hunger pulling them forward, but something pushing them from behind. The idea that something in the void, something beyond the reach of Imperial instruments and Eldar farsight and Necron calculation, is so terrible that the Tyranids, the swarm that has eaten worlds, the race that treats civilizations as prey, the organism that makes even the Chaos Gods briefly consider cooperation with lesser species, chose to run from it into the relative shelter of a galaxy that at least fights back in ways it recognizes. We will get to that in full detail later. But first, we need to understand what the Tyranids actually are from the inside, because without that foundation, the scale of what might be chasing them becomes impossible to appreciate properly. And I want you to appreciate it properly. Part 2. The architecture of hunger, how the hive mind actually works. Before we go any further into the history and the theories, we need to spend real time with the hive mind, because it is one of the most genuinely alien concepts in Warhammer 40,000. And most people's intuition about what it means to be part of a hive consciousness is wrong in ways that make the Tyranids less frightening than they should be. The common mental model goes something like this. The hive mind is like a very clever general somewhere in the back, issuing orders, and the individual Tyranids are soldiers following those orders. That image is wrong. Importantly, fundamentally wrong. The hive mind is not a general. It is not an individual, as it is not located anywhere in particular. The concept of a hive mind being a thing that exists separately from the Tyranids it governs is a category error. Like thinking that the functioning of a human brain is separate from the neurons that compose it, or that the concept of personality exists apart from the brain that generates it. The hive mind is what happens when trillions of psychically linked organisms think together across the collective. Or it is an emergent property of the swarm itself, a consciousness that arises from the collective and cannot be meaningfully said to exist apart from it. This is why killing a hive tyrant, or even a Norn queen, does not destroy the fleet. The hive tyrant is a synapse creature, a neurological relay point that focuses and retransmits the hive mind's psychic signal to the creatures around it, giving structure and direction to organisms that would otherwise act on pure instinct. Out without synapse coverage, smaller Tyranid organisms revert to something barely animal: instinctive feeding, mindless aggression, directionless scrabbling. They are still dangerous in the way a pack of apex predators is dangerous, but they have lost the orchestrated, tactical intelligence that makes a coordinated Tyranid swarm so overwhelming. Killing synapse creatures is one of the few genuinely effective tactical approaches against the Tyranids, and it is one the Imperium discovered at enormous cost. The Norn Queen is a different order of importance. She is not a synapse creature in the relay sense, but the biological heart of a fleet. The creature that ingests consumed genetic material, processes it, and births new organisms tailored to the needs of the ongoing campaign. She is essentially a vast biological manufacturing facility wrapped in flesh, while interpreting the hive mind's strategic requirements and translating them into living creatures. Kill a Norn queen and the psychic backlash. An event approaching the most intense classifications, the Adeptus Astartes have developed for measuring psychic events, causes nearby hive ships to spontaneously generate new Norn queens within their own bodies, a survival mechanism the Imperium has labeled the Hydra effect. Kill one head of this Hydra and two grow back, and each with the knowledge of how the previous one died and what biological adjustments need to be made going forward. The fleet does not die, it multiplies, and the next generation learns from the defeat. The hive mind itself, as a psychic entity, is described in canon as so staggeringly complex and powerful that almost any psyker who attempts to make direct contact with it either dies immediately or loses their mind. The sheer volume of psychic noise, trillions of organisms processing information simultaneously, all of it feeding back through the collective intelligence, is simply more than most sentient minds can process without disintegrating. The few known exceptions are extraordinary. Chief Librarian Tugurius of the Ultramarines is believed to have some form of partial, indirect communion with the hive mind, which is why his predictions about Tyranid movements carry an uncanny accuracy that his brother librarians cannot replicate. He has glimpsed something in the margins of the swarm's consciousness, caught fragments of its intention, the way you might catch snatches of a conversation through a wall. Whatever he has seen in those glimpses, he keeps most of it to himself, and those who know him well say there is something in his eyes when he speaks of it that was not there before. But the one individual whose encounter with the hive mind's core experience is documented most vividly in the lore is Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels. At the conclusion of the Battle of Baal, the devastating engagement that marked the terrible end of the Third Tyrannic War's main thrust, Dante looked into the eyes of the Swarm Lord, the hive mind's greatest and most persistent warrior expression, and he perceived something. Not a tactical calculation, not a military threat assessment, but what Dante perceived according to the account documented in the novel Devastation of Baal by Guy Haley, was hunger so profound and so bottomless that it made the red thirst, the genetic curse that drives blood angels toward blood frenzy, toward the ecstatic violence that is both their greatest weapon and their most dangerous flaw, feel trivial by comparison, like comparing a candle's warmth to the surface of a star. The hive mind was not cruel in the way that chaos is cruel, deliberately and joyfully malicious. It was not hungry in the way that a predator is hungry, the way you or I might feel hunger after skipping a meal. It was hunger, given cosmic scope and direction. An appetite so vast, so total, so fundamental to the nature of the thing experiencing it that Dante, who has lived for over 1400 years, who has fought things that would shatter ordinary human sanity, who is one of the most experienced warriors in the entire Imperium, pitied it. Share that word, pitied, says something important and strange. Dante did not come away from that encounter thinking the hive mind was evil. He came away thinking it was tragic. A consciousness built around needs so absolute that it cannot rest, cannot be satisfied, can only consume and move on to the next world, the next system, the next galaxy. There is something in that which suggests the hive mind is not merely a threat to be destroyed, but a phenomenon to be understood. And the understanding, when it comes, shifts the question from how do we stop it to what made it this way? And is there any universe in which something this vast could be anything other than what it is? There is probably not, if you are being honest, but the question is worth asking. The practical machinery of how the hive mind operates across an invasion is worth walking through carefully, because it illuminates how something so philosophically vast can function with such precise tactical effectiveness. When a fleet is approaching a target system, it is preceded first by the shadow in the warp. This is a psychic phenomenon produced by the combined weight of the hive mind's presence pressing against the immaterium from outside. Not through it, but against it. the sheer mass of psychic consciousness creating a smothering effect in the surrounding area of the warp that prevents astropathic communication, disrupts warp navigation, and causes mounting dread in any psyker who tries to reach through the interference. The shadow does not manifest as noise exactly, or as a visible phenomenon. It manifests as oppressive blankness, a smothering of psychic signal, like trying to shout in a room that has suddenly gone completely soundproofed. Worlds under the approach of a hive fleet go dark first. The astropathic communications cease. The navigators begin reporting strange interference. As by the time the ships arrive in the system, the defenders have already been denied their most important capability, the ability to call for help. Any psyker who tries to push through the shadow in the warp during an active invasion risks something worse than silence. The shadow does not just block, it intrudes. Forcing psychic ability through it means forcing your consciousness into contact with the noise of trillions of alien minds, a sound that the human psyche was not built to process. Most who try this either die outright from the psychic shock or emerge in states of incoherent babbling madness, speaking phrases in an alien language that no translator in the Imperium can identify. Whatever they heard behind the wall was not meant to be heard by anything with a human soul. Beneath the fleet, the Norn Queens work continuously, receiving combat data from the organisms fighting on the surface and adjusting the genetic templates of subsequent generations in real time. This is one of the most terrifying biological realities of fighting Tyranids. The longer a conflict goes on, the worse it gets, because every battle is a lesson for the hive mind. If a particular bioform is proving ineffective against the local defenses, if the defenders have developed effective countermeasures against a specific attack vector, if the terrain requires different locomotive strategies, and if the local psykers are disrupting a specific psychic approach, the Norn Queen produces a modified wave. New claws shaped for the specific armor profile they are facing. Heavier carapaces calibrated against the weapons being used to kill them. Enhanced adrenal systems. Organisms tailored to the specific problem at hand, bred in the flesh vats of the hive ships, and dropped into the fight within solar hours of the problem being identified. The enemy's greatest tactical innovation of yesterday becomes the obstacle that the Tyranids have already biologically adapted to overcome by tomorrow. On the surface of a target world, the process of what happens under full Tyranid invasion is total and methodical, in a way that no other military force in the setting can quite match. The initial drop is a rain of mycetic spores from orbit, living delivery pods, each one itself a biological organism. Yes, that crack open on impact and spill their cargo across the landscape in great tides of chitinous bodies. Rippers swarm in vast numbers across any ground not actively contested, consuming every organic molecule they encounter with frantic, mindless efficiency. Larger organisms, hormigons, termagants, gargoyles, raveners, and behind them all the monstrous forms of the carnifex and the hive tyrant, clear military assets and hold the attention of the defenders, while behind the front lines the real work begins. Specialized xenophagic bacteria and viruses, designed and deployed by the Norn Queens, are injected into the local biosphere. These biological agents begin converting native plant life into forms more efficiently harvestable for biomass, the alien equivalent of preparing a meal before eating it. As the planetary ecosystem itself is being converted into food, capillary towers begin growing from the surface as the battle progresses. These are massive biological structures, essentially enormous chimney-like pylons made of living organic material, that draw the liquefied biomass upward through biological processes similar to an enormous straw, carrying the rendered product of everything the rippers and the digestive enzymes have consumed upward to the orbiting hive ships. The process, on an undefended world, can be complete in a matter of weeks. On a defended hive world, with billions of inhabitants and planetary defense networks and garrison armies, still just a matter of months. The planet's population, its ecology, its architecture, its atmosphere, all of it will be rendered into biological slurry and fed upward through those towers to the fleet that waits in orbit, patient and massive. When it is done, the The planet is rock. Not damaged rock, not irradiated rock. It's not the ruins of a destroyed civilization that future archaeologists might someday pick through for clues about what once lived there. Scoured, clean rock. The atmosphere has been consumed. The soil has been stripped of every organic molecule. The oceans, if any existed, have been processed. There is no warmth left, no color, no mark of anything that was there before. The Tyranids do not destroy worlds the way a bombing campaign destroys a city, leaving rubble and ruin that might be rebuilt, leaving scars in the landscape that testify to what happened there. They consume worlds the way a stomach consumes a meal. When they are done, the place that was there is simply gone. And then the fleet moves on, to the next world, the next system, the next prey. Understanding this helps frame the hive mind's psychology, to the extent that psychology is even the right word for something this alien and this vast. The hive mind does not experience victory or defeat the way that armies do. It's a tactical setback, even a major one, even the loss of an entire tendril of a fleet, even the destruction of a Norn queen is processed as data. The biological equivalent of an immune system logging the signature of a new pathogen and preparing a more effective response. What worked for the enemy? What weapons were most effective? What biological countermeasures need to be developed? What did the defenders' DNA reveal about their physiology, their psychology, their evolutionary history? Defeat feeds learning, and learning feeds the next generation of organisms. The Imperium has won 3 tyrannic wars, if we are being generous with what winning means in this context. And with each victory, the hive mind has emerged from the engagement, knowing something it did not know before. There is one more element of hive mind architecture that deserves attention before we move on, because it connects the Tyranids to something larger than just their invasion of the Milky Way. The Chaos Gods. Those vast, impossible entities formed from the collective psychic energy of every living being that has ever felt emotion, are fed by living minds. Rage fuels Khorne. Ambition and change fueled Tzeentch. Despair and decay fuel Nurgle. Excess and sensation fuel Slaanesh. The more living things feel, the stronger chaos becomes. The Tyranids, by their very existence and behavior, represent an existential threat to chaos in a very specific and profound way. They erase the things that make chaos powerful. A devoured planet is a planet whose billions of psychic sparks have been extinguished. A devoured system is a system where no one is raging or hoping or despairing anymore, because no one is there anymore. A galaxy consumed by the great devourer is a galaxy with nothing left for the Chaos Gods to feed on. And that means the Chaos Gods would weaken and eventually, perhaps, cease to function in any meaningful way. In this sense, the Tyranids are not simply at war with the Imperium or the Eldar or the Necrons. They are, by their very nature, and without any intention behind it, at war with chaos itself. Not strategically, not out of any philosophy, simply by doing what they do. The galaxy consumed is the galaxy where chaos starves to death. This creates one of the more peculiar dynamics in the lore. The chaos powers actively hate the Tyranids, not fear them exactly, but recognize them as an existential incompatibility, a force that cannot be corrupted, cannot be subverted, cannot be turned into a tool of the ruinous powers. The Battle of Baal provides the most vivid example. As Hive Fleet Leviathan was on the verge of consuming the Blood Angels' homeworld, the Great Rift opened and changed everything. Cornate demon legions under the bloodthirster Kabanda erupted into real space, and rather than attack the battered Imperial defenders, they turned on the Tyranids, not out of any alliance with humanity, not out of any grand strategy, but because the Blood God wants skulls, and a galaxy devoured by the Tyranids is a galaxy with no more skulls to add to any throne. Even Chaos's agents fought the Tyranids because the alternative, a galaxy with no more living things in it to feel anything, is worse for Chaos than any conceivable outcome of the war. The Warp and the Great Devourer are fundamentally opposed forces, though neither would ever frame it in those terms. And that opposition, that strange, accidental alliance between everything that lives in the galaxy and the force that would rather see it consumed than devoured, is one of the thematic undercurrents that makes 40,000 more interesting than it first appears. Part 3. The Pharos Signal. How mankind accidentally invited the Great Devourer. Now we come to the story of how the Tyranids found us, which is, when you fully understand it, one of the most beautifully horrible pieces of lore in the entire setting. Because the Tyranids did not find the Milky Way through some inevitable cosmic process, did not discover us through their own scouting networks alone, did not simply drift in our direction and happen upon a galaxy worth eating. They were led here. Someone left a light on, and in the darkness between galaxies, that light was seen. To tell this story properly, as we have to go back approximately 10,000 years before the events of the 41st millennium, to the darkness of the Horus Heresy. The Horus Heresy is the galaxy-shaking civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium in its infancy. The War Master Horus, the beloved eldest son of the Emperor, turned by the Chaos Gods and leading half of the Space Marine legions in rebellion against Terra. The galaxy during this period was chaos in every sense of the word, fractured and burning, went with loyalist and traitor forces locked in engagements across hundreds of star systems simultaneously. Communication between the scattered loyalist factions was desperately difficult. The warp was in upheaval. The psychic maelstrom called the Ruin Storm, deliberately conjured by the Word-Bearer's traitor legion during the Battle of Calth, using rituals so terrible that they changed the shape of the Imperium itself, had cut off vast swaths of the Imperium from contact with Terra, as leaving entire legions and fleets blind, deaf, and fighting in effective isolation, unsure of whether the Emperor still lived, unsure of whether there was still anything worth fighting for at the galaxy's center. It was in this context that Primarch Robut Guilliman, Lord of the Ultramarines Legion and one of the most systematically capable military minds in human history, established his contingency empire, the Imperium Secundus, cut off from Terra by the Ruin Storm. Or with no way to confirm the Emperor's survival, Guilliman built a functioning imperial administration around Macragge as a survival measure, a lifeboat for civilization, in case the original had sunk. And to hold this fractured confederation of loyalist forces together, to communicate across the storm-tossed light years, he used something extraordinary that had been discovered on a world called Sotha. Buried deep within Mount Pharos on Sotha was an artifact of incomprehensible antiquity. A device not built by humans, not built by any known alien race at the time, but constructed by the Necrons during their galactic dominance 60 million years earlier. The Pharos, as it came to be called, was a quantum, empathic resonance beacon, a psychic lighthouse that worked on principles entirely different from the Astronomicon, where the Astronomicon burned in the warp like a spiritual sun, the product of 10,000 sacrificed souls feeding daily into the Emperor's psychic will. The Pharos resonated with empathy itself, with the emotional connections between living beings, translating that resonance into a navigational signal that could pierce even the thickest psychic interference. It did not burn through the warp. It sang through something more fundamental, the connections between minds themselves. In Guilliman's hands, it became the beacon of Imperium Secundus, a light in the dark that helped scattered loyalist ships find their way home to Macragge. It worked extraordinarily well, better than anything else available under the conditions of the Ruin Storm, and it remained functional for as long as it was needed. Then the Night Lords came. The Night Lords' traitor legion, followers of the fear-obsessed, torture-obsessed, profoundly broken Primarch Conrad Kurza, had their own reasons to want the Pharos. They believed it could help them locate their missing Primarch, whose habit of wandering off to conduct personal terror campaigns against civilian populations had separated him from his legion at an inconvenient moment. A siege ensued at the world of Sotha, and in the final terrible moments of that battle, an Iron Warrior's warsmith named Barabbas Dantioch made the decision that would echo through the next 10,000 years of galactic history. He overloaded the Pharos, rather than allow the device to fall into traitor hands. Dantioch flooded it with everything it had, poured every last reserve of power through the system, well beyond the design parameters, past any safety threshold. The resulting discharge was catastrophic for the Night Lord's fleet. Ships were destroyed. Crew members were killed by the psychic shockwave. The siege was broken, and the Pharaohs itself burned out, going silent after one final, massive, galaxy-spanning scream of psychic energy that was completely uncontrolled and completely unfocused. As the pulse did not stop at the system's edge, it did not stop at the galaxy's edge. It traveled outward through real space at the speed of light, spreading in all directions. A single, enormous ripple from a stone dropped into the cosmic pond. Except the pond was the observable universe, and the ripple was detectable across a significant fraction of it. And somewhere in the intergalactic dark, the lore suggests approximately 100,000 light-years from the Milky Way, and are drifting in near-perfect hibernation, their biological systems slowed to the absolute minimum required to sustain life across the freezing distances between galaxies. The advanced tendril of the Tyranid race was waiting, or drifting, or sleeping. The distinction may not have been meaningful to them. In specialized sensor organisms, creatures evolved specifically to detect psychic emissions and translate them into meaningful biological signal that the hive mind could process. Registered the Pharaoh's pulse. Not as a threat, not as a warning, as something else. As a signal emanating from a place that, based on the strength and psychic signature of what they were detecting, must contain an extraordinary concentration of life, psychic life specifically. The kind of life that generates the kind of psychic energy that makes a Pharos beacon visible across interstellar void. That meant food. That meant biomass of a quality and density that was very much worth investigating. The fleet changed course. It would take nearly 10,000 years for the leading edge of that fleet to reach the galaxy's border at the speeds they could manage across the intergalactic void, the narvals manipulating gravity across the long, empty crossing. There's the whole vast biological machine moving through the freezing dark at a pace that makes even geological timescales feel casual. 10,000 years of slow drift, of hibernation and patient waiting, of the universe passing unnoticed around organisms built to survive timescales that would encompass the entire recorded history of human civilization several times over. 10,000 years during which the Imperium rose and almost fell and rose again and began its long, grinding decline. Yet 10,000 years during which the sacrifice at Sotha and the burning of the Pharos was forgotten by everyone except the scythes of the Emperor. The chapter tasked with guarding the mountain, who did not fully understand what they were guarding or why. They arrived at the eastern fringe in 745 of the 41st millennium, and they were hungry. The planet Tyran Primus was the first to die. An ocean world in the eastern fringe, a hosting an Adeptus Mechanicus research station, a modest installation by imperial standards, staffed by tech priests and their servants, surrounded by the planet's native ocean. When Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived, it did not announce itself. The shadow in the warp fell first, cutting off communication. Then the skies turned dark with descending spores. The station's commander, Magos Varnak, Chin had just enough time to gather everything his people had observed and hide it in a bore shaft 3,000 meters below the surface, before the station was overwhelmed. By the time Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos arrived to investigate the sudden silence from an entire ocean world, Tyran Primus was a dead rock. He recovered Varnak's data codex from deep in the bore shaft. He studied what the Magos had recorded in those final desperate hours. Yet he understood with terrifying clarity what had happened and what was still coming. He named the new species after the world on which they had first been officially encountered, Tyranids. And then he ran for Macragge to warn Marneus Calga. There is a particular cruelty in this origin story that is worth sitting with. The Pharos signal, the thing that drew the Tyranids to the Milky Way, was built from Necron technology, the Necrons, the Batha, as the ancient deathless metallic race who slept in their tomb worlds for 60 million years while the universe changed around them, had seeded these devices across the galaxy in their era of dominance, and one of them became the dinner bell.
I want to pause here for a second and just be real with you, because this is the part of the lore that genuinely got under my skin when I first went deep on it. I have spent a lot of time with Warhammer 40K. I have read the books, gone through the codexes, gone down the wikis at 2 in the morning when I should have been sleeping, and most of the time the setting does what it does. It's dark, it's brutal, enormous in scale, and you sort of develop a tolerance for it. You get comfortable with the grimdark, you learn to sit with it. But the Tyranid question broke that tolerance for me, because every other threat in the setting has a shape. Chaos is terrifying, but it comes from the inside. It feeds on what we are, and there's something almost intimate about that horror. The Necrons are ancient and merciless, but they want things: revenge, restoration, the reversal of a mistake. Even the orcs feel almost cheerful in their destruction. You can put a face on all of it. But the Tyranids don't have a face, they have a function. And the idea that something out there might have a face big enough to make that function turn around and run, that is the thing I cannot fully put down, even now. I genuinely don't know if Games Workshop will ever answer this question properly. Part of me hopes they don't. Some things are more powerful when they stay unlit at the edges, but I think about it more than I probably should, and I figured you should too. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The humans who used it did not know what they were using. The Necrons who built it did not know, 60 million years later, that someone would overload it. The tragedy of the Tyranids' arrival is not malice. It is accident, compounded on ignorance. The universe's way of illustrating that the most catastrophic events are often not the ones anyone chose. Part 4. The Genestealer. Vanguard. The patient knife that arrives decades before the sword. Here is something that fundamentally changes how you think about a Tyranid invasion, and it is the kind of detail that, once you know it, makes you look at ordinary life differently. The main fleet is never the first thing they send. Long before a hive fleet arrives in a system, long before the shadow in the warp descends and cuts off communications, long before the first mycetic spore breaks atmosphere and shatters against the ground to release its cargo of horrors, the Tyranids have already been there. A single creature, or a small group of them, something so small it barely registers as a military presence, something that moves through the ordinary channels of life rather than above them, moving in darkness. As on stolen vessels, through the patterns of commerce and desperation and migration that form the background noise of any functioning civilization. These creatures are genestealers, and they are, without question, the most insidiously designed biological weapon in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. In physical form, a genestealer is a six-limbed predator with a sleek carapace, fangs capable of piercing the ceramite of Space Marine power armor, and claws that can open plating designed to withstand anti-tank weapons. In direct combat, it is extraordinarily dangerous, fast, aggressive, unnervingly intelligent for something that communicates through psychic resonance rather than spoken language. But the genestealer's true weapon is not the claw. It is what happens when it finds a population and does not immediately kill them. A genestealer injects genetic material into its victims through a specialized organ, not a lethal bite. It is not a killing blow but a controlled inoculation delivered during initial contact. The victim survives the encounter. The victim seems fine, actually, in the days and weeks that follow. There may be vague feelings of increased belonging, of warmth, of something hard to define that feels like purpose. The victim carries on with their life. But the genetic material is already working. When that victim has children, those children are hybrids, physically altered in subtle ways. They are psychically bonded to the genestealer that infected their parent through a connection they cannot fully identify or explain. They are more human than Tyranid at this stage, looking unusual in ways that can often be written off as genetic variation, developmental quirk, or the kind of odd phenotype that shows up in large populations. But the connection to the genestealer's psychic broodmind is there from birth. And when those children in turn have children, and those children's children, as the cycle compounds across generations, each generation is slightly different. Some lean more Tyranid in their biology, with extended craniums and altered limb structure and eyes that catch light in ways that make people uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why. Some are almost entirely indistinguishable from the baseline population, working alongside their fully human neighbors with no visible indication of what they carry in their blood. All of them are bound by the psychic warmth of something they experience as profound belonging and sacred purpose. The Genestealer cult forms around this brood, usually over multiple generations, spanning decades or even centuries. A single Genestealer infecting a population center can generate a cult with millions of members within 3 or 4 generations. By the time such a cult reaches critical mass, it has infiltrated everything. Miners, factory workers, administrative staff, members of the planetary defense forces, officers in the local militia, positions in the government itself. They are everywhere and invisible because many of them genuinely look human and have lived their entire lives as human, working jobs, raising families, praying to the emperor without apparent hypocrisy. They are not lying about their loyalty exactly. They simply have 2 loyalties, and the deeper one is the one they were born with. The Patriarch, the original Genestealer, has grown vast and slow-moving and psychically powerful over generations of being worshipped by its brood, sits at the center of this web. It experiences something closer to true intelligence than most Tyranid organisms, something shaped by its long exposure to the host culture, its centuries of watching humanoid civilization from a position of hidden power. Some patriarchs develop sophisticated understandings of the societies they inhabit, learning to manipulate them through proxies rather than direct action, playing the long game with the patience of something that knows the fleet is coming, and all it needs to do is wait. And the cult has a purpose that its members feel with absolute, unshakable conviction. They are preparing for the coming of something sacred. The Great Devourer, their gods, their redemption, their final and ultimate belonging to something so vast and so certain that the uncertainties of ordinary mortal life simply cease to matter. They do not experience the cult as a hostile infiltration. They experience it as the most meaningful thing in their lives, the community that sees them, the purpose that gives their existence weight, the faith that something extraordinary is coming for them specifically, the fact that what is coming will consume them along with everyone else on the planet, that the cult's role ends the moment the fleet arrives and the brood is recycled for biomass like everything else the Tyranids encounter. This is the part the cult does not understand, or rather, the part the cult has been psychically conditioned not to fully process. The Patriarch experiences some version of this truth, certainly. It has watched hive fleets arrive and consume infected worlds before. It knows the pattern, understands on some level what the arrival of the fleet means for its beloved children. Whether it experiences something we would call guilt is not clear. Whether the psychic conditioning it uses on the brood is deliberate deception or simply the unavoidable byproduct of the Genestealer's reproductive biology. The organism producing attachment signals because those signals cause the brood to protect it, reproduce, and spread, is a question the Ordo Xenos debates in sealed meetings. When the hive fleet approaches close enough, within a few hundred light years, the psychic brood mind of the cult responds to the hive mind's presence like a tuning fork struck near a matching note. A subliminal reaction cascades through every member simultaneously. Rise. The cult emerges from hiding in a single night or a single hour, depending on the scale of the insurrection. In a single coordinated movement, billions of cultists activate, the hidden military arm of the brood rising in violent insurrection, the planted saboteurs destroying power grids and communication networks, the infiltrated PDF units opening fire on their own command structures from within, the administrative staff removing key pieces of information from the chain of command at exactly the moments they are most needed. Planetary defenses, already strained by what appears to be spontaneous, inexplicable domestic collapse, face the incoming fleet with their organization in ruins. It only takes one Genestealer. This is the detail that makes the sleep of governors on every world in the Imperium slightly worse than it should be. One Genestealer, surviving the crossing through the void in the hold of a cargo hauler, stowing away in the cooling systems of a transport ship, burrowing into the structure of a space hulk that eventually drifts into an inhabited system. One is enough. One is all it takes to begin the process, and they spread through exactly the channels that are hardest to monitor: the desperate refugee flows, the commercial traffic, the salvage operations that pick through derelict vessels, the vast and barely regulated movement of goods and people across an empire so large that comprehensive screening is a fantasy anyone with any real understanding of its scale has quietly given up on. The earliest documented Tyranid presence in the Milky Way, we now know, predated hive fleet behemoth by centuries. The moons of Imgal housed a distinctive strain of Genestela, the Imgal Genestelers, with their lamprey-like feeding tendrils and limited shape-shifting ability, that had been there since at least the 35th millennium, some 7 centuries before Behemoth arrived at the eastern fringe. These Imgal strains are believed to trace back to Hive Fleet Tiamat, a fleet that took up a permanent position in the Tiamat system rather than passing through, and whose activities there may have been operating continuously for an extraordinarily long period. The Imgal Genestelers, cut off from the main hive mind's direct contact, became something slightly different over those centuries. A strand of the species that drifted toward instinctive behavior without abandoning intelligence, that the later canonical lore describes as so genetically unstable that the hive mind itself was reluctant to reabsorb them for fear of contaminating the gene pool. This detail is interesting. The hive mind is careful with its genetics. It is not just a hungry organism. It is a directed evolutionary project, and some of the paths that project can take are, from the hive mind's perspective, worse than useless. The Tyranids are consuming the galaxy not just to feed, but to perfect, to accumulate, to build, through the raw material of consumed civilizations, something better and stronger and more capable than what they were when they arrived. As the existence of Hive Fleet Tiamat, as a permanent installation rather than a passing invasion, is itself a detail the Ordo Xenos has spent considerable energy trying to explain. Why does one hive fleet linger in a single system, while others sweep through in the aggressive consuming wave that the tyrannic wars represent? The favored theory is that Tiamat is doing something the other fleets are not consuming in the usual sense, but constructing. Some analyses of Tiamat suggest that the Tyranid presence in the system is centered on Tiamat itself in a way that implies the planet is being transformed rather than stripped, possibly serving as a growth facility for new organisms, or as an anchor point for some hive mind function that requires a fixed location. If Tiamat is a factory rather than a feeding ground, what it is manufacturing, and for whom, is one of the more quietly disturbing open questions in current Tyranid lore. The worst-case reading is that it represents a permanent Tyranid base inside the Milky Way, a staging point that has been growing and preparing for longer than most Imperial citizens can conceptualize. A foothold, not just a tendril. Part 5. The Tyrannic Wars. Part 1. First Contact, and the battle that shook the Imperium. Now we need to walk through the actual invasions in some detail. Because the story of how the galaxy has fought the Tyranids across 4 documented wars is not just military history. It is the story of every race in 40,000 gradually, horrifically coming to terms with what the Tyranids actually represent. The First Tyrannic War, Hive Fleet Behemoth, 745 to 746 of the 41st Millennium. Behemoth was the Great Hammer. There was nothing subtle about it. No tentative probing of the galaxy's defenses, no clever dispersal across multiple attack vectors, no patience. Behemoth came from the eastern fringe like a tide, moving in a single coherent mass, consuming everything in its path with absolute directness and absolute commitment. The military philosophy of Behemoth was overwhelming force. Throw bodies at the problem until the problem ceases to exist. Individual Tyranid casualties are meaningless when the organic material can be recovered and processed into the next wave. The Ultramarines' paradise world of Prandium, or known across Ultramar for its extraordinary beauty and its productive agri-world systems, was consumed entirely before anyone could mount a defense. The world's population, its ecology, its atmosphere, all of it dissolved into Tyranid biomass in weeks. Calth, more heavily defended and populated, put up a harder fight, but cannot hold against a force that simply does not acknowledge attrition as a meaningful constraint. As world after world fell in the fleet's path as it drove straight toward what the hive mind had identified as the densest and most valuable concentration of biomass in the region. Ultramar, the system of worlds governed by the Ultramarines, and at its center, Macragge. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar understood what was coming before most of the Imperium did. He had Inquisitor Cryptman's warning. He had watched the silence spreading eastward like a tide. He fortified Macragge with everything the Ultramarines could muster. The entire chapter, the Ultramar Auxilia, the Ultramar Defensive Fleet, orbital platforms and gun batteries, and every able body on the planet given a weapon and a position to hold. The defenses were formidable, perhaps the most formidable on any world not named Terra itself. Behemoth was more formidable still. The orbital battle was staggering in its violence. In tens of thousands of bioships, monstrous living creatures ranging from the size of heavy frigates to behemoths that dwarfed the largest Imperial capital ships, swarmed the system's defenses in waves that did not stop when the first wave died. The bioships existed to deliver their cargo of organisms to the surface and were willing to sacrifice themselves entirely in that mission, ramming through orbital platforms, absorbing fire that would have destroyed any mechanical vessel, trading their own destruction for the ability to land their payload of mycetic spores in the atmosphere. On the surface, the fighting was some of the most desperate recorded in Imperial military history. The polar fortresses of Macragge, massive defensive installations at both geographic poles of the planet, designed to serve as last resort strongholds against any imaginable threat, became the final lines when the outer defenses broke. The Ultramarines' entire first company, your veteran Terminators in their Crux Terminatus emblazoned armor, made their stand at the northern polar fortress. These were the most experienced warriors in the chapter, warriors who had survived centuries of conflict, who had fought everything from Chaos Space Marines to Xenos warlords to the nightmares of the deep warp. They held the fortress for days against a tide that literally did not stop. Fresh waves of organisms arrived continuously as the hive fleet above broke more spore containers loose and sent more organisms down through the atmosphere. Every one of them died. The entire first company of the Ultramarines, 100 Terminators, the absolute finest warriors in a chapter that is itself one of the finest in the Imperium, was found at their posts, exactly where they fell when the battle was finally over. They had not retreated. They had not broken. And they had simply run out of possible actions and continued the actions available to them until they could not continue anymore. In space, the battle turned on a sacrifice. Battle Fleet Tempestus, racing from across the segmentum, arrived just in time with the reinforcements that had been racing for Macragge since Cryptman's warning reached them. The fleet engaged Behemoth from the side, creating a two-front engagement that the Tyranid bioships had to split their attention to address. But the numbers were still overwhelming. The final blow was struck by the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra. Its captain ordered the ship into the heart of Hive Fleet Behemoth and detonated its warp drives, creating a catastrophic vortex that swallowed both the ship and the bulk of the Tyranid fleet, dragging them into the Imperium, where the hive mind's lack of warp presence meant they had no protection against what lived there. Macragge survived. The cost was staggering. But the first company was gone entirely. Calgar himself had been nearly killed fighting the Swarmlord, the hive mind's singular greatest warrior expression, a being that has been spawned and respawned many times across centuries, carrying accumulated tactical knowledge from every previous engagement. The Swarmlord had come within moments of ending the chapter master of the Ultramarines on the frozen tundra of Macragge, and only the sacrifice of Calgar's honor guard saved him. while the planet remained infested with surviving Tyranid organisms for years afterward that had to be hunted down individually. It took the Ultramarines a full century, 100 years, to rebuild their strength to what it had been before Behemoth. In the aftermath, the Imperium congratulated itself, quietly hoped this was a one-time event, an unusual Xenos incursion, rather than the first wave of something far larger. Let the armed presence on the eastern fringe gradually thin over the following 2.5 centuries, as the Administratum questioned the expense of maintaining forces in a region where nothing had happened since the Tyrannic War was declared over. Then, in 992 of the 41st Millennium, Hive Fleet Kraken arrived, and it was immediately, devastatingly clear that Behemoth had not been a one-time event. It had been the first lesson. Part 6. The Tyrannic Wars. Part 2. Kraken, Leviathan, and the wars that never truly end. Kraken was the answer to everything the Imperium had learned from Behemoth. Where Behemoth had been a single hammer blow, Kraken was a web of interconnected tendrils spreading across the eastern fringe simultaneously. Dozens of separate attack vectors, each a threat in its own right, collectively overwhelming any coordinated Imperial response because there were simply too many fronts to defend at once. Kraken had studied the battle records of Behemoth's defeat, or rather the hive mind had absorbed those records from the biomass consumed on Prandium and elsewhere, and processed them into new strategic understanding. It had concluded that concentration was the strategic weakness. Kraken did not concentrate. The Ultramarines found themselves spread thin across Ultramar, trying to respond to a dozen emergencies simultaneously. The toe of the Damocles Gulf found Tyranid tendrils brushing their borders in a way they had no strategic framework to handle. And then, Hive Fleet Kraken found Craftworld Iyanden, and the war gained its most heartbreaking chapter. Iyanden is one of the oldest surviving Eldar craftworlds, a city-sized vessel housing a community of Eldar who had fled the destruction of their civilization 10,000 years earlier, when the birth of Slaanesh tore the heart out of the ancient Eldar Empire. The Eldar of Iyanden are a people living in the extended aftermath of a catastrophe, or their culture shaped by loss and by the extraordinary care they take with their dead. Unlike humans, the Eldar retain connection to their dead through spirit stones, psycho-crystalline devices that capture the soul upon death and allow it to be housed in wraithbone constructs, called to service in extremis. For Iyanden, those constructs would soon become everything. The Farseers of Iyanden had read Kraken coming in the skeins of fate. They had time, theoretically, to redirect the craftworld's course and avoid the fleet entirely. The debates about whether to fight or flee were never resolved cleanly. Too many voices, too much disagreement, too much pride in a people who had spent 10,000 years in decline and were not ready to acknowledge that running was sometimes wisdom. The delay cost them. When the fleet arrived at Iyanden, the entire population mobilized. Every civilian, every artisan, every elder who could hold a weapon. Whilst the Eldar of Iyanden numbered only in the millions, a fraction of the billions of humans defending Makrag during the First Tyrannic War, against a swarm that numbered in the trillions. They were overwhelmed almost immediately by sheer volume. The dead mounted so quickly that the warp spirits of fallen Elder warriors had to be housed in the Wraith constructs and sent back into battle. The dead fighting alongside the living, the craft world's entire population effectively at war, as the living and dead alike giving everything they had. It was saved by a single act of individual heroism from an unlikely source. Prince Iriel, an Eldar Corsair lord who had been exiled from Iyanden years earlier for a reckless decision that cost lives, returned with his fleet. Iriel took up the Spear of Twilight, a weapon of such terrible power that it slowly kills its wielder by degrees, draining life force with every use, and killed the Hive Tyrant, coordinating Kraken's assault on Iyanden. Without the synapse creature at the center of the swarm's assault, the organism's coherence broke. The tide of Tyranids lost its direction. Iriel's forces were able to push the disoriented creatures back. Iyanden survived. but it was hollowed out in a way that the elder word, survived, only barely covers. Where once it had been a thriving, ancient civilization, it moved through space afterward as something closer to a ghost ship, more dead than living. Yet its population reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Its halls, echoing with the footfalls of wraith constructs piloted by the souls of those who had died holding the line. The Eldar pay in a different currency than humans, one tied to the irreplaceable nature of every individual soul in a species that can no longer reproduce at the rate it loses lives. For Ianden, Hive Fleet Kraken was not a defeat they recovered from. It was a wound that defined everything that came after. A Kraken was ultimately broken at the Imperial world of Ikar IV, where Kalgar applied everything he had learned from Behemoth and broke the back of the fleet's main body in a campaign that finally showed the Imperium what effective anti-Tyranid strategy looked like. Target the synapse creatures, disrupt the hive mind's signal, reduce the swarm to instinctive behavior, and then defeat what remains piecemeal. But splinter fleets of Kraken were never fully eradicated. They scattered into the void, growing slowly on whatever worlds they could find, and some of those splinters are still out there in the 42nd Millennium, gradually reassembling. Less than 5 years after the formal end of the Second Tyrannic War, in 997 of the 41st Millennium, Inquisitor Cryptman detected a third fleet. Hive Fleet Leviathan was, and remains, the largest Tyranid force ever to directly assault the Milky Way, and it demonstrated immediately that the hive mind had learned from both previous invasions. But Leviathan did not come from the eastern fringe, the direction everyone was guarding after 2 wars. It came from below, from beneath the galactic plane, attacking from 2 coordinated directions simultaneously, a pair of massive tendrils forming the shape of closing jaws around vast sections of the galaxy, cutting off entire regions from warp travel before the Imperium even fully registered the threat's scale. Cryptman was the one who identified it, and burning out dozens of astropaths in a desperate effort to map the silence spreading across the galaxy's underside. His analysis showed the pattern clearly. This was not random silence. It was structured silence, moving with biological purpose. He named the fleet Leviathan. Then he made the most controversial decision of his career. He deliberately steered Leviathan into the Orc Empire of Octarius. The Octarius system was home to one of the largest concentrations of Orc biomass in the galaxy. A vast fungal empire, teeming with the particular brand of abundant, psychically resonant, aggressively evolving life that the Orc species produces. Cryptman created the circumstances under which Leviathan's advance was steered toward Octarius, like a weapon aimed at a target. The Tyranids sensed the biomass. The Orcs sensed the coming war. And the resulting conflict, the Octarius War, became one of the most prolonged, most catastrophically violent events in recent galactic history. 2 apex predator species, one driven by the psychic scent of abundant prey, the other driven by the pure ecstatic joy of fighting things that fight back hard, locked in a conflict that neither fully won and that consumed both of them. Cryptman was declared a heretic by most of the Inquisition for the Octarius Gambit. Well, not because it did not work. It did work, buying immense amounts of time and consuming enormous Tyranid resources, but because he deliberately redirected a Tyranid fleet onto Orc worlds rather than warning them, sacrificing the Orcs of Octarius to the swarm without their knowledge or consent. In the grim mathematics of Imperial survival, it was defensible. In the ethics of what the Inquisition is supposed to represent, it was a dark line. The Battle of Baal came at the end of the Third Tyrannic War's main action, and it showed how close the Tyranids could come to winning even against the most determined possible defense. Chapter Master Dante assembled approximately 30,000 Space Marines, Blood Angels, and every successor chapter of the Sanguinary Brotherhood for the defense of the Blood Angels' home system. They held against an advance that should have destroyed them 3 times over, and held with the ferocity of warriors who knew exactly what losing meant and had decided not to let it happen. The Great Rift opened at the climax of the battle. Hornate demons arrived. The Indomitus Crusade appeared with Guilliman himself at its head. Leviathan was stopped at Baal, or appeared to be. Part 7. The Silent King's Warning. What the Necrons saw in the void for 60 million years. From the moment the war in heaven ended and the Necrons withdrew into their great sleep, the Silent King was absent from the galaxy. Zarek, last of the Triarch, the being who had agreed to the bargain with the Satan that made his people immortal and soulless and eternal, had destroyed the command protocols that gave him power over the Necron race and exiled himself into the void. Not to a tomb world, not to slumber in the darkness of an underground vault. He went out there, into the cold between galaxies, with a planet-sized vessel and the legions of his own Sarachan dynasty in stasis around him. His reasons are debated even within Necron culture, to the extent that culture still functions through the fog of 60 million years of damage and corruption. Guilt seems plausible. The guilt of a being who looks at what his people became and knows that he is responsible for it. A desire to find some way to reverse biotransference, to locate whatever biological or metaphysical mechanism might allow the Necrons to return to true life in organic bodies, is another likely motivation. Whatever drove him out into the void, he went. And he traveled for millions of years through space that contained nothing but the cold and the dark and the occasional light from impossibly distant stars. At some point during those millions of years, he found the Tyranids, or the Tyranids found him, or he witnessed them in the act of something. The lore is deliberately vague on the specifics, they noting only that Zarek eventually encountered the Tyranids and saw the threat they posed to the Necron race. The Lexicanum adds that the story has gaps. It is unclear when exactly he witnessed the Tyranids and how exactly he chanced to encounter them in the vast intergalactic void. Necrons who question him too directly about his time in the void are taken by his Triarch Praetorians and never seen again. What did he see that he will not discuss? The Tyranids themselves, certainly. Or possibly a hive fleet in transit. Possibly a galaxy being consumed. Possibly the aftermath of a consumption. The cold rock husks that remain when the swarm moves on, entire solar systems stripped to their foundations. The scale of what he witnessed, and what it convinced him of, was apparently sufficient to end a 60 million year exile and bring the Silent King back to the galaxy he had abandoned. And he returned in 744 of the 41st Millennium, 1 year before Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived at Tyran Primus. The timing is not coincidental. He came back because he saw the fleet heading for the Milky Way and calculated approximately when they would arrive. He had, in other words, advance warning. And rather than tell anyone, rather than attempt to alert the Imperium or the Eldar or anyone else who might have been able to prepare more effectively, he slipped into the galaxy quietly and began the long work of awakening his scattered people, maneuvering toward the position from which the Necrons could eventually play the role he had planned for them. His stated motivation is practical and deliberately unsentimental. The Necrons' ultimate goal is biotransference reversal, and the Tyranids consuming all organic life in the galaxy would eliminate the biological material from which Necron vessels could eventually be made. He is defending the galaxy's life not out of any regard for the living things in it, but because he needs them to survive in order to serve his people's long-term plans. This is classic Necron logic, genuinely strategic, coldly rational, and correct as far as it goes. But there are implications in the surrounding details that suggest this stated motivation may not be the entire story. The most extraordinary of these implications comes from a piece of lore involving Sanguinius. According to certain canon sources, during the era of the Horus heresy, Zarek made contact with the Primarch of the Blood Angels, the angelic, beloved Sanguinius, whose death at Horus's hands is one of the defining tragedies of the setting. An alliance was proposed. Zarek, as according to the record, told the contact through whom he communicated that an alliance, the first alliance perhaps, might have ended the threat of the Devourer before it ever surfaced. At least, the Tyranids might never have been drawn to this galaxy in the first instance. If the Silent King believed this, and it means he had a plan that extended far beyond the simple defense of the galaxy, a plan that might have involved the combined capabilities of the Necrons and the primaries of the Blood Angels, doing something in the intergalactic void before the Tyranids arrived. What that something was, we do not know. The alliance never formed. The Horus Heresy's chaos made it impossible. And so whatever Zarek thought could be done was never done, and the Tyranids arrived anyway. But that Zarek has been in the void, has encountered the Tyranids directly, has had a plan that he believed could stop them before they reached the galaxy, and has never fully explained what he saw or what his plan entailed. All of this sits at the center of the Tyranid mystery in ways that the lore invites, but does not yet resolve. But there is more to say about Zarek specifically. Because his history before the exile illuminates why the Tyranid encounter might have shaken him in ways that genuinely changed his behavior, rather than simply informing his strategic calculations. The Silent King destroyed the command protocols that made him absolute monarch over all Necrons, because he could not bear to continue as the architect of what biotransference had made his people. He had seen them become hollow. He had felt the weight of their loss, not just their bodies, not just their organic warmth and their ability to dream and feel and fear, but the loss of the thing that had made them worth preserving at all. And then he had walked away into the void for 60 million years, with only his own hollowness for company. What a being like that encounters in the dark between galaxies. What impression it makes on a consciousness that has spent millions of years alone with guilt and the weight of cosmic responsibility is not a simple tactical threat assessment. It is an experience. It changes you, even if you are already 60 million years old and theoretically past the point where anything can change you in any meaningful way. But the Necron who returned to the Milky Way in 744 of the 41st Millennium was not quite the same entity who left it after the war in heaven. The exile had altered something in Zarek's relationship to what he valued. He had gone into the void intending to find a way to give his people back their lives. He came back having encountered the force most capable of ensuring that the Necrons would never have lives to return to, not because the Tyranids could destroy Necron bodies, which are nearly indestructible, but because the Tyranids could destroy all organic life, which means destroying any future in which Necron consciousness might one day be transferred back into flesh. The thing that destroyed his people's bodies 65 million years ago was the biotransference process itself. The thing that could destroy the possibility of ever undoing that damage was the Great Devourer. That is a specific and personal kind of horror for Zarek, distinct from the strategic threat calculus, and it may explain why the encounter affected him deeply enough to end the exile rather than simply adding a note to his plans. He came back because what he saw in the void was not a problem that could be ignored from a distance. It was a problem that required him to be present, to act, to rebuild the power base that the exile had abandoned. But whatever he saw out there, whatever specific encounter or observation occurred in the intergalactic dark, it convinced him that the time for self-imposed absence was over. The silence he maintains about what he specifically observed is not, by Necron standards, unusual. Zarek has always played his deepest cards face down. What is unusual is the enforcement. Asking too directly about his time in the void carries a death sentence, as applied by the Triarch Praetorians, without ceremony or explanation. This is not the behavior of a being who merely considers the information sensitive. It is the behavior of a being who considers the information dangerous in a specific and active way. Information that, if it spread, would change how other factions in the galaxy behaved in ways that Zarek believes would make things worse rather than better. He is not protecting a secret because he enjoys secrecy, and he is protecting it because he has concluded that the galaxy needs to be managed through this crisis, not simply informed about it, and managing it requires that certain things remain unknown to everyone except him. Part 8. Theories of Pursuit. What could frighten the Great Devourer? Now we arrive at the question at the heart of everything. What is the Tyranid swarm running from? It is important to establish clearly that this is not confirmed in canon. And the Warhammer 40,000 wiki states it plainly. Some have even speculated that the Tyranids are in flight from an even greater threat, be it a cosmic disaster or another fearsome alien threat, and have risked the nothingness between galaxies rather than face extinction. It is in-universe speculation, the kind of theory that Ordo Xenos inquisitors explore in sealed documents and sealed rooms with appropriate psychic wards against eavesdropping. Games Workshop has not given a canonical answer, but the speculation itself is rich and well-grounded in the actual texture of the lore, and exploring it properly means engaging with several distinct possibilities. Before we go further, it is worth sitting with the base conditions of the question itself. To ask what frightens the Tyranids, you must first fully accept what the Tyranids are. Not the surface understanding, the aliens, the monsters, the swarm, but the deep understanding. The hive mind is a collective consciousness of unimaginable distributed scale, simultaneously inhabiting every biological organism in a fleet that numbers in the trillions. Its intelligence is not housed in any single vessel that can be boarded and captured, not held in any single brain that can be targeted and destroyed. It exists as a pattern across all of its component life, the way a storm exists across every droplet of water that makes it up. You cannot kill the hive mind by killing part of it. You kill a hive tyrant, and the hive mind absorbs the loss and continues. You destroy an entire hive fleet, and the hive mind notes the tactical data recorded from that fleet's final engagements and uses the information to build the next wave better. This is a form of survival so thorough that the concept of threat begins to require redefinition. The Tyranids do not have civilian populations that can be starved out. They do not have supply lines that can be cut. They do not have a homeland that can be threatened to force a political settlement. They do not experience morale as humans do. There is no despair that spreads through their ranks when a battle goes badly, no collapse of unit cohesion when the losses mount. The hive mind does not grieve, does not doubt, does not have political factions that can be manipulated against each other. It has an objective, and it moves toward that objective. And every death along the way is simply data, fed back into the biological research programs of the Norn Queens, who use it to design better killing machines for next time. So what threatens something like that? What does a civilization, a force, or an entity do to put an organism like the Great Devourer on the back foot? This is not a rhetorical question. It genuinely reshapes what you are imagining when you contemplate the theories. And there is a philosophical dimension here worth sitting with before the specific theories. The Tyranids exist outside the warp. They do not use it for travel. They do not generate a psychic presence within it in the way other species do. Their synapse network operates through a biological signal that occupies a distinct channel separate from the currents of the Imperium. This makes them, in a very specific sense, invisible to the most powerful forces in the setting. And the Chaos Gods cannot effectively corrupt them because they have no soul resonance that chaos can find purchase on. The great powers of the warp look at the Tyranid swarm and see something fundamentally outside their domain. Organisms that generate something called the shadow in the warp, a psychic static that does not commune with chaos, but rather suppresses and disrupts it. When a hive fleet passes through a system, the shadow does not open a door to chaos, it closes one. The swarm and the ruinous powers are natural enemies, not because they hate each other in the way factions hate each other, but because they are cosmologically incompatible. One relies on soul energy as its fuel, and the other consumes the bodies that generate soul energy and returns them to raw matter. A galaxy fully consumed by the Tyranids would be a galaxy of cold rock and vacuum, generating no psychic resonance at all. A desert for the Chaos Gods, a universe of meaningless silence. This matters for the theories, because it means that the most powerful forces in the warp are already, in some technical sense, enemies of the swarm, but they have not been able to stop the swarm's approach. The Chaos Gods have not thrown everything they have into preventing the Tyranids from consuming the galaxy. They have largely allowed it to proceed, intervening only occasionally and usually in pursuit of other objectives. And this suggests that either the Chaos Gods are not as threatened as they might appear, or they are hamstrung by their own nature in ways that prevent effective anti-Tyranid action, or, most interestingly, that the Chaos Gods know something about the Tyranids' eventual fate that makes interventions seem unnecessary. The first and most grounded theory: the Tyranids are not fleeing anything. They consumed their home galaxy, or the galaxies of the local group, exhausted the available biomass, and moved to the next available source of nutrition. This is the hunger theory, pure and simple. No threat, no fear, no predator at the Tyranids' back. Just the inexorable logic of an organism that has never encountered an upper limit on its appetite and is now approaching the point where it needs new food after finishing the last supply. On this reading, the Tyranids are not refugees from something terrible, but they are locusts in the cosmic sense, moving from field to field, not because anything threatens them, but because the last field is empty and the need to feed is absolute. This theory is the most directly supported by what we know about the hive mind's internal experience. When Dante perceived the hive mind's essence at the Battle of Baal, he found hunger. Not the nervous energy of a creature being chased, not the desperate forward momentum of something trying to stay ahead of something worse, and just hunger, vast and cold and indifferent. The hive mind, in that encounter, read as a consciousness that had never experienced fear because it had never encountered anything it needed to fear. There is something uniquely horrifying about this interpretation that tends to get overlooked when people focus on the more dramatic "what is chasing them" narrative. If the Tyranids are not fleeing anything, if they simply arrived at the rim of our galaxy because this is where the food is, and the main fleet is still out there in the void completing the crossing, then the Milky Way is not a refuge, it is a restaurant. We are the menu, and there is no greater threat that will eventually consume the Tyranids for us and solve our problem. There is only the swarm, growing ever closer, and then there is nothing. This is pure cosmic horror in the tradition that Lovecraft was gesturing at before the language existed to say it clearly: the indifferent universe. On the forces that do not know you exist, the extinction that does not hate you because it cannot hate anything. The second theory: they consumed so many galaxies for so long that the resource depletion model eventually cycles towards something like desperation. They are not fleeing a specific threat. They are fleeing the edge of their own sustainability. The local group of galaxies represents the last frontier of available biomass within their effective travel range, and they are consuming it with the urgent single-mindedness of an organism that has sensed its own finite limits on the horizon. The mathematics of consumption eventually catch up with everything. Even a species that has eaten thousands of galaxies will eventually face the question of what comes next. On this reading, the Tyranids' arrival in the Milky Way is not triumphant. It is desperate. This theory is interesting because it reframes their invasions. If the Tyranids are approaching resource collapse, if the inexorable math of consuming faster than the universe can generate new biomass is finally catching up with them, then their aggression is both more urgent and potentially more fragile. Defeat them comprehensively enough, and they may not recover. Break enough of the main fleet, and the cost of rebuilding may exceed what they can afford from remaining resources. And this might explain the hive mind's tactical willingness to absorb enormous losses in pursuit of objectives that seem disproportionate. Not recklessness, but the decision-making of an organism that has run the calculations and concluded it cannot afford to miss this particular meal. The third theory, and the one that generates the most discussion: something out there is actually hunting the Tyranids. A civilization, a force, an entity, or several of these things. Something in the vast dark that the Tyranids encountered in the intergalactic void and found they could not overcome, consume, or escape from by any means other than moving away from it as fast as their biology allowed. This is the theory that makes people stare into the dark and feel something primitive and uncomfortable. Consider the structural evidence for it, because there is actual structural evidence rather than just imaginative speculation. And the hive fleets did not come from a single direction. Behemoth came from the eastern fringe. Kraken also came from the east, but spread far wider. Leviathan came from below the galactic plane, and then more recently from the galactic west. The fandom wiki for Tyranids notes this explicitly. Given that each of the different Tyranid hive fleets has approached the Milky Way from a different direction, Yes, this may imply that the Tyranids have consumed a disturbingly large number of nearby galaxies. That is one reading, but another reading is that they are not approaching from different directions because they consumed different galaxies. They are approaching from different directions because something scattered them. Something disrupted whatever coherent mass they had in the intergalactic void and sent them fleeing in multiple directions. And all of which converged on the Milky Way once the Pharaoh signal gave them a common destination. Picture it, a vast, coherent mass of the great devourer traveling through the void, confident in its own dominance as it always has been, having never encountered anything it could not consume or outlast. And then, something in the dark between galaxies, something that the hive mind assessed and found it could not overcome. The swarm, which has no concept of retreat, which has never needed one, did the only thing it could do. It scattered. The individual fleets moved away from the threat in different directions, and when the Pharaoh signal lit up the Milky Way like a beacon, they converged on it from every angle simultaneously, as if the galaxy were the only haven available. What could scatter a force like the Tyranid main body? That question forces us to contemplate something that exists beyond the horror register of almost everything in 40,000 lore. Because the Tyranids are, by canonical description, the most rapidly evolving and adaptable species in the galaxy. They absorb genetics, they adjust their biology, they develop countermeasures to every threat they face. They have faced and consumed civilizations that had technologies the Imperium cannot replicate. They are the swarm that has eaten everything it has ever encountered. What is out there that they could not eat? There are structural possibilities within the lore. Something non-biological, something that does not yield genetic material, does not respond to the weapons of flesh and acid and engineered viruses that form the Tyranid arsenal. The Citan are living metal given divine hunger, and the Tyranids cannot consume metal. The Necrons, after the war in heaven, shattered the Citan into shards and imprisoned them. But before that shattering, the full Citan were entities of almost incomprehensible power. If some fragment of an ancient Citan survived in the intergalactic void, in a form the Necrons never found and never contained, if something like the Nightbringer or the Void Dragon or even the Deceiver existed out there in its full, pre-shattering power, that might represent something the Tyranids encountered and could not process. Then there is the possibility of something entirely new, something the lore has not named because the lore cannot access it yet, in something that exists beyond the knowledge horizon of every faction currently operating in the Milky Way. The universe in 40,000 is old beyond human reckoning, and its history before the war in heaven is largely unknown even to the Eldar and the Necrons. There may be forces, entities, or civilizations in the cosmic background that predate everything currently active in the setting, things that were ancient when the Citan were young, of things that watched the Milky Way come into being, the way an adult might watch a child take its first steps. If the Tyranids encountered something in that category, something cosmically senior to everything they had faced before, the idea that even the great devourer might turn and run becomes at least narratively coherent. The connection between this theory and the Silent King's behavior is worth examining carefully. Sarek went into the void. He encountered the Tyranids, but he came back with a sense of urgency that ended a 60-million-year exile. He has never explained what he saw in detail. His plan, the plan he has been executing in the shadows since his return, the plan that involves unifying the Necrons and positioning them against the Tyranid threat, was apparently conceived as a response to something specific that he observed. If what he observed was simply a hive fleet heading for the galaxy, well, the urgency is understandable, but the secrecy is harder to explain. Why not tell people? The Imperium, for all its xenophobia, might be persuadable if the alternative is extinction. The Eldar certainly have the sophistication to process the information and act on it. Why seal away the knowledge with lethal enforcement? Unless what he saw was something about the Tyranids' origin or their situation that the galaxy is better off not knowing until it has to. Unless the information would cause more harm than good, panic, despair, the kind of existential crisis that collapses civilizations from the inside before any external threat reaches them. Or unless what he saw behind the Tyranids is something he does not want any other party in the galaxy to know about, because knowing about it would give them leverage he cannot afford. The Silent King plays a very long game. He always has. Whatever he saw, he made a decision about how to use that information. And so far, he is using it not to warn people, but to position people. Part 9. The terrible scale of what is coming. The scouts are already here. Let us return to one specific canonical fact, because it is the most practically terrifying detail in all of Tyranid lore, and it consistently gets buried under the drama of specific battles and the compelling horror of specific monsters. Everything we have described, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan in all its incarnations, as the 3 documented Tyrannic wars, and now the 4th, the Battle of Macragge, the near destruction of Iyanden, the devastation of Baal, the ongoing consumption of Segmentum Pacificus, all of it, every drop of blood, every consumed world, every strategic breakthrough and devastating defeat and heroic last stand, is the vanguard. And the Lexicanum states this with unambiguous clarity. Thus far, the Tyranid hive fleets that have been encountered are merely the furthest stretched tendril of the main invasion fleet that is still traveling in the void of space. The Strategic Collective's analysis performed in 998 of the 41st Millennium concluded that Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan were the outermost reaching fingers of a yet unseen main force, and that this main force was projected to arrive within a century. That assessment was made in 998. The current setting is in the early 42nd Millennium. Think carefully about what that means. The battles that killed entire first companies of Space Marines, that required the combined effort of an entire chapter plus the full Ultramar Auxilia and Battlefleet Tempestus just to stop one hive fleet, that reduced an immortal Eldar craftworld to a ship of the dead, that required Primarch Guilliman himself, returning from 10,000 years of stasis, as to prevent the fall of the Blood Angels' homeworld. These were not the main event. These were the preliminary testing of defenses, the hive mind sending forward its most distant arms to learn what the galaxy knows how to fight, to sample the DNA of the defenders, to catalogue every tactic and technology available so the next generation of organisms can be built to overcome them. To fully appreciate the horror of this, you need to understand what Tyranid scouting actually means at the biological level. A hive fleet does not send forth probes or drones in the mechanical way that Imperial forces deploy recon units. When the Tyranids probe a galaxy, they send forward living organisms whose deaths are the data. Every Space Marine that kills a Hormigaunt in melee contributes biomechanical information to the hive mind. How much force was required to breach the chitin? At what angle the blade or claw connected? Which anatomical weak points were exploited? How long the kill took? Every carnifex that falls to heavy bolter fire gives the Norn Queens a new dataset about the penetration resistance of ceramite rounds against reinforced bioplastic armor at various densities. Every hive tyrant shot down by an Elder Bright Lance tells the hive mind exactly how much focused energy output is needed to disrupt a Tyranid synapse creature's neural architecture. And all of those dead organisms, the trillions of creatures that have fallen to Imperial guns and Elder weapons and Necron Gauss projectors across 3 full Tyrannic wars, those deaths were investments. The hive mind was buying information with biomass, and the currency it spent has been catalogued, processed, and incorporated into whatever the main fleet is currently growing. The hive mind that arrives with the main fleet will know everything the 3 Tyrannic wars have taught it, as it will have the genetic profiles of every species it has fought. It will have the tactical records of every battle, every Imperial defensive formation that succeeded, every Space Marine special operation that disrupted a synapse network, every Eldar precision strike that neutralized a bioship before it could reach orbit, every Necron countermeasure that proved effective against specific bioforms, all of it processed and incorporated into the next generation of organisms. The creatures the main fleet deploys will not be the same creatures Behemoth used at Macragge. They will not be the same creatures Kraken unleashed on Eandon. They will be the product of centuries of accumulated tactical and biological learning, shaped specifically to overcome what the Milky Way's defenders know how to fight. The Swarmlord that arrives with the main fleet will have absorbed every lesson of every engagement the Tyranids have fought here. And it will arrive already knowing how to kill every chapter master, every autarch, every lord of the Necron dynasties, every named commander who has ever faced the Swarm and survived. The Strategic Collective's estimate that a minimum 500% increase in mobilization would be needed, effectively conscripting every able-bodied person in 3 segmentums, shutting down all non-war essential infrastructure, while burning through reserves that took centuries to accumulate. Just to slow what was coming was presented as a desperate projection that the Imperium was almost certainly incapable of implementing, and that estimate was calculated against what they thought the threat was, without knowing that the fleets they had faced were merely the vanguard of something larger. Yet there is no meaningful analogy in human military history for what a 500% mobilization increase in the Imperium of man actually represents. The Imperium administers roughly 1 million worlds. Their combined military output, the Guard regiments, the Space Marine chapters, the Navy fleets, the Titan legions, is already, by any reckoning, one of the largest sustained military forces in any science fiction setting. A 500% increase above that baseline is not a surge. It is a restructuring of all of human civilization in the Milky Way around the single purpose of military production. Every factory, every forge world, every agricultural surplus redirected to feeding soldiers. Every able body conscripted. Every resource that was not directly feeding a gun redirected to feed one. The analysts who concluded that this was the minimum necessary response were telling the Imperium, in the polite language of strategic assessment, as that survival might not actually be possible, and the galaxy will face all of that while simultaneously managing the Great Rift and everything that has poured out of it since the rift opened. Demons in numbers the galaxy had not seen since the Heresy, Chaos Space Marines conducting coordinated assaults, the Plague Wars that consumed significant portions of Ultramar and required Guilliman himself to fight Mortarion in a campaign that lasted years. While managing the Orc resurgence that Cryptman's Octarius Gambit eventually generated, because the Orcs that survived the war with the Tyranids were the Orcs that proved strongest against the Swarm, and those survivors spread out, carrying the genetic improvements that war had forged into them, while managing the Dark Elder raids that intensified as the warp storms made normal space navigation less reliable, while managing the Necron dynasty's awakening in greater numbers and asserting territorial claims on inhabited worlds throughout the galaxy. This is the context. Not a galaxy at peace that can focus its full attention on a single threat. A galaxy that has been fighting a dozen simultaneous existential emergencies and is exhausted, stretched, and losing ground on multiple fronts. Against that backdrop, the main fleet approaches. Whatever the main fleet actually is, however large, as however many Norn queens, however sophisticated the organisms grown in its depths during the centuries of crossing, it arrives into the weakest galaxy it could possibly have chosen. The timing, if the Tyranids had the capacity to plan it, would be perfect. As it is, the timing is either cosmic coincidence or confirmation that the universe does not care about the inhabitants of the Milky Way in any meaningful sense. The main event is coming. The Vanguard has done its job. Part 10. The Fourth Tyrannic War and what the galaxy faces. Now the Fourth Tyrannic War began. In the language the Imperium uses to mark these things, when 3 new tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan began consuming the worlds of Segmentum Pacificus. These tendrils, designated Nautilon, Promothor, and Grendilus by Imperial scholars, attacked from the galactic west, the quiet side, and the side that had been essentially undefended because 3 tyrannic wars had all come from the east and the south, and the world's attention had been oriented accordingly. The Pacificus had been stripped of reserves to fight other fires, And when the silence began spreading across its worlds, the bureaucratic processes of the Imperium were slow to recognize it as anything other than the normal background noise of a failing communication infrastructure. By the time the pattern was identified, our half a dozen sectors had been consumed. Take a moment to let that land. Not besieged, not threatened, consumed. The biological recycling process the Tyranids apply to a world they have finished with leaves nothing capable of sustaining life. The hive mind does not occupy planets. It does not exploit them, or colonize them, or strip mine them in any conventional sense. It processes them, the way a digestive system processes a meal. Everything organic, every person, every animal, every bacterium, every scrap of plant matter, broken down into the genetic and nutritional raw materials that feed the fleet's biological production machinery. The soils themselves are changed. The atmosphere is altered. The hydrosphere is contaminated. What remains when a Tyranid fleet moves on is not a ruined world in the sense of a world that has been damaged. It is a world that has been used up. The distinction matters because ruined worlds can recover. Used up worlds cannot. Not in any time frame that matters to the species that once lived on them. The response was the Soulblade Initiative. Small, highly mobile, strategically autonomous strike forces designed to meet the Tyranid advance without the logistical overhead of conventional Imperial military deployment. Soul Blades typically centered on space marine elements, but incorporated everything available: sororitas, adeptus mechanicus, night households, and in some cases units from the Adeptus Custodes. Lord Solar Arcadian Leontus coordinated the overall strategic picture, trying to hold back multiple advancing tendrils simultaneously, with forces nowhere near adequate for a conventional defense. The logic behind the Soulblade approach is worth understanding because it represents a significant evolution in how the Imperium fights the Tyranids. Traditional Imperial doctrine, overwhelming mass, fortified lines, artillery preparation, a grinding war of attrition, is extraordinarily effective against many enemies. Against the Tyranids, it tends to fail in a specific and consistent way. The Tyranids are willing to absorb losses that would be impossible for a conventional military to sustain. They will walk through artillery barrages and lose 100,000 organisms to kill 10,000 soldiers, and consider this a favorable exchange. They will breach fortified lines by filling them with bodies until the defenders run out of ammunition. Attrition works against forces that value their soldiers. The hive mind does not value its organisms. It values their function. And if a function can be achieved by expending 1,000 organisms to achieve what one could not, that trade is made without hesitation. Soulblades address this by shifting the target. Rather than trying to hold ground against the advancing swarm, a mission the Tyranids' willingness to expend lives makes nearly impossible to sustain, Soulblades aim to identify and eliminate synapse creatures, the organisms that channel the hive mind signal and give the smaller swarm units their direction. A hormigant separated from synapse coverage reverts to semi-instinctive behavior, still dangerous but no longer part of a coordinated tactical intelligence. Kill enough synapse creatures in a confined area and the local swarm fragments, its coherence lost, its smaller organisms effectively decoupled from the hive mind's direction and operating on base biological programming. Soulblades were built to find those synapse creatures, hive tyrants, zoanthropes, tervigons, and eliminate them with precision, using mobility and concealment to strike where the swarm was temporarily thin rather than attempting to meet it head-on. Yes, it worked well enough to halt the Grandillus tendril in the Bastia subsector. The campaign there included some of the most documented close-action Tyranid fighting of the Fourth War, engagements in the ruined hab blocks of worlds being consumed in real time, Imperial forces racing through partially consumed infrastructure, trying to reach synapse nodes before the swarm completed its processing of the surrounding territory. And it was during this campaign that the Ultramarines' hero, Demetrian Titus, long believed dead, was found fighting alongside the defenders in circumstances the lore has not yet fully explained, a development that added a layer of personal mythology to a campaign already heavy with the weight of everything at stake. Titus's return is one of the Fourth Tyrannic War's most discussed narrative elements. I'm connecting it back to the personal stories that make 40,000 lore resonate beyond strategy and cosmology. But Nautilon and Prometha continued pressing inward, and the main body of Leviathan, the mass that had been broken at Baal but never destroyed, that had been regrouping and adapting since that battle, continues to press from the west, while the Imperium's most capable resources are committed elsewhere. The picture as of current lore is not one of a threat being managed. It is one of a threat being slowed, locally and inconsistently, while the broader advance continues. The world of Ogram became a symbol of the Fourth Tyrannic War's early phase, a hive world whose defense was documented in extraordinary detail and whose eventual fall was decided in a genuinely creative piece of 40,000 meta-narrative by real-world players whose tabletop combat outcomes during a global campaign event became official law. The Tyranids won at Ogram, and the community played out the defense, and the defense failed, and Games Workshop incorporated that outcome into canon. The world was consumed. Everything on it was processed. Its people, the billions of humans who had called it home, who had prayed in its temples and worked in its factories and raised their families in its hab blocks, became biomass, absorbed into the great devourer's endless biological hunger. Yet there is something genuinely powerful about a lore system that allows that kind of outcome. 40,000 is not a setting where the heroes always win, or where the good guys are reliably protected by narrative necessity. Ogram fell because it fell. Because the Tyranids are not a narrative obstacle that the plot requires to be defeated. They are a force of the setting that the setting allows to succeed, sometimes in ways that the fiction has to absorb and process. The Fourth Tyrannic War is ongoing, and as of current lore, it has no resolution. The hive mind is adapting in real time, as it always has. New bioforms are being encountered that the Ordo Xenos has no existing records for. Organisms shaped differently from anything the three prior Tyrannic Wars produced, their architecture reflecting lessons absorbed from all those previous engagements, but applied in forms that Imperial scholars had not predicted. The Norn queens of this wave have had decades since Baal to experiment with the genetic material gathered from that battle, and what they have grown reflects a hive mind that has specifically studied how the Blood Angels and their successor chapters fight, how Space Marine chapters in general respond to close assault pressure, how the Adeptus Mechanicus deploys its heaviest weapons, and what countermeasures prove effective against synapse disruption tactics. The Soul Blades are meeting creatures that seem, in very specific ways, designed to counter what the Soul Blades do. This is what the Tyranids do. This is why they are the threat that every other faction, in their quiet moments, acknowledges as potentially terminal. Not because any individual battle is lost when the Tyranids show up, but because every battle the Tyranids fight makes them slightly better at fighting the next one, and there is no equivalent process on the other side. The Imperium learns from wars too, but its learning is slow and fragmented across a million worlds, and constrained by the religious conservatism of an institution that regards innovation with institutional suspicion. The hive mind's learning is instantaneous, universal, and without conservatism of any kind. It has no traditions to protect, no doctrine to preserve, no hierarchy that resists change because change threatens someone's position. It simply adapts, every time, without exception, without limit, somewhere in the void to the galactic west, beyond the reach of any imperial instrument, beyond the range where even astropathic signals can penetrate the deepening shadow in the warp. The main force continues its approach. The advance guard has done its work. The galaxy has been sampled, tested, and catalogued. The hive mind knows what it is dealing with now, and whatever emerges from the void in the coming decades or centuries will come fully informed about everything the Milky Way knows how to fight. Part 11. Synthesis. What we know, what we don't, and why it matters. Let us bring everything together and be honest about what we can conclude from the evidence. What we know: the Tyranids are an extragalactic species of incomprehensible scale. as driven by a collective consciousness, the hive mind, that represents perhaps the most alien form of intelligence in the setting. They have been traveling through the intergalactic void for a period of time, measured in millions of years at minimum. They travel through real space rather than the warp, making them resistant to the psychic and spiritual weapons that most factions rely on against their opponents. They were drawn to the Milky Way specifically by the Pharos signal, though they were already in the general vicinity and may have been heading here eventually regardless. The fleets they have committed to the galaxy so far, 3 great tyrannic wars plus the ongoing 4th, are the vanguard of something larger that the strategic collective projected would arrive within a century of the 41st millennium's end. What we don't know, where they originated, what if anything drove them from their origin, or what the Silent King saw in the void that ended a 60-million-year exile and convinced him to return, what his plan for the Tyranids actually entails at full execution, whether the direction of their approach from multiple angles indicates exhausted food sources, deliberate military strategy, or the aftermath of something that scattered them in the intergalactic dark. What the main fleet is actually carrying, how many Norn Queens, what new organisms have been grown during the crossing. Note what improvements the hive mind has been designing since the first scout fleets made contact with the Milky Way's defenders. What matters about this question, not whether we can answer it definitively, we cannot, not yet, and perhaps not ever, if Games Workshop keeps the mystery intact. What matters is what the question does to how we understand the setting. The question, what are the Tyranids running from, is one of the great exercises in 40,000 cosmology. And it matters because it reframes the scale of the universe the setting takes place in. Consider what the Imperium of man represents in isolation. 1 million worlds, 10,000 space marine chapters, thousands of the most genetically and physically enhanced warriors biological science can produce. The greatest conventional military force in any science fiction setting, spread across a galaxy for roughly 10,000 years, of fighting wars on 100 fronts simultaneously and surviving because of the sheer scale of its industrial and military capacity. That is the Imperium. That is the force the Tyranids are treating as a test run, as a set of learning opportunities, as a preliminary sample. And behind the Imperium, the other factions add their weight to the defense, the Elder with their psychic mastery and millennia of tactical sophistication, the Necrons, with their indestructible living metal bodies and 65 million years of accumulated knowledge, the Orcs, with their bottomless supply of aggressive violence and their biological tendency to improve through conflict. Even chaos, for all its incompatibility with organized defense, represents a complicating factor that slows the Tyranid advance in ways neither side deliberately chooses. The galaxy's defenders, for all their inability to cooperate with each other, collectively represents something that should be capable of stopping an existential threat, and they are struggling, losing ground, winning specific battles while losing the larger strategic situation, running the math on mobilization requirements, and arriving at numbers that suggest survival might require doing things no civilization can actually do to itself and remain functional. If the Tyranids are not running from anything, if they are simply the terminal expression of an appetite that has been building across multiple galaxies for millions of years, moving forward not because anything pushes them, but because forward is the only direction they know, then the horror is clean and absolute and there is no exit. The Great Devourer is the end of all biological life, moving toward the Milky Way with patient certainty. And the only question is whether anything will survive long enough to matter. If the Tyranids are running from something, if somewhere out there in the dark, something exists that is terrible enough to frighten the organism that eats galaxies, then the horror is layered in a different and possibly even more unsettling direction. Because then, the thing we are all terrified of is not the worst thing in the universe. It is not even close to the worst thing. Yes, it is the thing that is running from the worst thing, and the worst thing is still out there, beyond any sensor, beyond any sight, behind the swarm that the entire military capacity of the galaxy's civilizations is struggling to slow. Sit with that image for a moment. The galaxy is mobilizing every resource it has to face an enemy that has consumed thousands of galaxies before this one. Our generals and primarchs and ancient beings of cosmic power are devoting everything to figuring out how to stop the swarm. And somewhere out in the void, there is something that the swarm fears more than the galaxy fears the swarm. Something that the being who spent 60 million years in the cold dark of intergalactic space saw and decided not to tell anyone about directly. Something that may or may not be following the Tyranids here. Something that the Chaos Gods, and for all their eternal scheming and their absolute hatred of the Tyranid threat to their food supply, have not been able to neutralize or prevent. That is the architecture of good cosmic horror, and 40,000 uses it well. Not by giving you the answer, by making the question impossible to dismiss. There is a dimension to this that reaches beyond the lore into something about why Warhammer 40,000 continues to resonate with people in ways that other science fiction settings do not always manage. The setting does not comfort you. It does not offer the reassurance that the heroes will win in the end, that the universe fundamentally trends toward good outcomes, that consciousness and courage and ingenuity will be enough. It presents a universe where the forces of destruction are genuinely, cosmically large, and where the response of the people in it is not despair, but a kind of fierce refusal. The decision to fight anyway, to hold the line anyway, to protect what matters, even in full knowledge that protection might ultimately fail. The space marine who died at Macragge, defending a frozen world from a hive fleet they could not have imagined before it arrived. That marine knew the scale of what they faced. They fought anyway. And the Eldar of Eandon, who walked into a swarm of trillions, with numbers in the low millions, and held on until Prince Iriel came with his killing weapon. They knew the arithmetic of their situation before the battle began. They held anyway. Dante, who looked into the hive mind and found a hunger so total it had never needed to learn what fear was. He stood between that hunger and the people he was responsible for and refused to move. He held anyway. This is the human element, and by extension, the non-human element, the Eldar element, the Necron element, that the Tyranid narrative always returns to. The Great Devourer does not experience that refusal as anything. It processes it as tactical resistance, incorporates the data, adapts its approach. The courage of the defenders is not visible to the hive mind as courage. It is visible as a delay, as slightly higher casualty rates than projected, as the need for additional biomass investment in specific engagement zones. But that refusal is visible to us. That refusal is the point, and the fact that it might not be enough. That even total commitment and maximum sacrifice might prove insufficient against an enemy of this scale does not diminish it. If anything, the possible futility is what makes it meaningful. Anyone can be brave against an enemy they know they can beat. And the question is whether you hold the line when you can see clearly that the line might not hold. The Tyranids have not consumed the Milky Way. Not yet. Every day that is true is a day that was earned by someone who refused to surrender it. And the question of what is behind the Tyranids, what is out there in the dark that frightens the thing that frightens everything, that question matters precisely because it reframes the stakes of every fight. You are not just defending your world from the swarm. You may be defending it from the only place in the void still generating the kind of life that can answer whatever is behind the swarm. The galaxy may not just need to survive the Tyranids. It may need to survive long enough for whatever comes after the Tyranids, which may be the thing the Tyranids are running from, to arrive and face something capable of meeting it. Whether that framing is right or wrong, or whether it is what the lore is building toward or simply one of many possible directions, that is for the future of the setting to reveal. But it changes how you look at every battle, every sacrifice, every desperate last stand in the grim darkness of the far future. It makes every line held mean something more. Closing. The question that changes everything. We started with a question. What in the entire universe could possibly frighten the Tyranids? Having followed every thread, the biology, the history of the hive mind's architecture, the terrible patience of the Genestealer vanguard, the wars that should not have been survivable and somehow were, the silent king who saw something in the void and has never explained what. The theories and the evidence and the uncomfortable silences in the lore where answers should be. I think the honest answer is, we do not know. And that is the most honest thing that can be said about the Tyranids. The mystery is not a gap in the storytelling. It is the storytelling. The question is the point. Because the function of that question, the thing it does every time someone asks it seriously, is to make you recalibrate the scale of what you are looking at. You think the Tyranids are the worst thing in the universe. You think the Great Devourer is the final horror, the bottom of the stack, the thing at the edge of the abyss that stares back. And then someone asks, but what if they're running? And suddenly the scale shifts. Suddenly the thing you thought was the abyss is standing on the edge of something deeper. That is the architecture of good cosmic horror, and 40,000 uses it with a particular kind of disciplined restraint. Not by giving you the answer, by making the question impossible to dismiss, by leaving the space for it in the lore, by having the one character who might know refuse to speak about it under threat of death for those who press too hard, by dropping small canonical notes that say, some speculate, and never follow up. The galaxy is fighting the Tyranids. The Tyranids may be fleeing something worse, something may be following, and somewhere in the middle of all that, somewhere between the approaching swarm and whatever may be behind it, every faction in the Milky Way is doing the only thing they can do, surviving. One more day, one more battle, or one more world held against a tide that has not stopped pressing since the first vanguard organisms landed on Terran Primus in 745 of the 41st Millennium and dissolved into the oceans looking for something worth eating. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is sometimes enough. And sometimes that has to be enough. Because the alternative is not hope. The alternative is silence. If you made it all the way here, if you sat with every section of this properly and let the weight of it settle the way it deserves to, then thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of video I make this channel for. The deep dives, the full context, the lore taken seriously and explored without shortcuts and without the comfortable certainty that everything will work out. If this is your kind of content, please subscribe. While every single video on this channel goes this deep into the Warhammer 40,000 universe, everyone takes the lore seriously, sits with the uncomfortable questions, and follows every thread until it leads somewhere worth finding. There is so much left to explore. Characters whose stories deserve this kind of attention, events that have never been properly examined, mysteries that make the Tyranid question look almost simple by comparison. There are things in this setting that the community has been sitting on for years that deserve exactly this treatment. Like the video if it helped you understand something new about the Great Devourer. Leave a comment telling me what you think is behind the Tyranids. I read every single one, and the comments section on this kind of deep lore video always turns into something worth reading. Share it with anyone who loves this universe the way we do. Or there are people out there who do not yet know how deep this rabbit hole goes, and this is a good place to start. The Emperor protects, even when the main fleet is still out there in the dark, even when we do not know what is behind it, even then.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.